I'm glad that you're here. My name is Winston Tan, Professor of Medicine, Mayo Clinic. So far, we have discussed about the different challenges that you have for a cancer survivor. We have talked about nutrition, how nutrition can help you recover from cancer. We have discussed about the emotional turmoil that a cancer patient and a survivor would encounter and the best practices on how to improve your chances to emotionally recover from the cancer. And additionally, we have talked about sexual dysfunction and how this could affect you after treatment and years to come. Today, I want to discuss with you all the best topic, which is why and how of clinical trials. Hopefully, at the end of the day, I will be able to convince you and help you understand about this opportunity about clinical trials. Clinical trials have been an ongoing thing that has been done for years, but I want you to be aware that 85% of clinical trials unfortunately fail to retain enough patients and they don't finish on time. Only 50% of the sites that have a clinical trial have one or more patients enroll, and 40% of the budget that we put into clinical trial is used for recruitment of patients. This is indeed a challenge, and 30% of patients who are on clinical trial drop out for unknown reasons. Clinical trial has transformed the care of many cancers, have improved survival, have decreased recurrence, and many drugs from bench to patient have done this. It has transformed the treatment of your cancer. And I would call it a challenge and opportunity, a challenge to increase the number of patients who participate in clinical trials and the opportunity for better understanding of why clinical trials are being done today. Globally, millions of dollars, or actually billions of dollars, have been spent on clinical trials. But we need more of the clinical trials to better improve treatments. And hopefully, with the immunotherapy, with the new drugs that are targeted, we can improve survival and personalize the treatment of your cancer, which in turn can lead to recovery from your cancer. We can see here that if 1.2 billion is spent on recruitment, how is this being done? It can be done through patient referral, newspapers, research ad, internet. Centralized recruitment can use EMR review, meaning review of your medical records, ads, and referral. I want to emphasize here that first, the patient has to know that these clinical trials are available. Secondarily, the physicians have to be willing and to have the time to discuss about these clinical trials and look at the pros and cons of what clinical trials are. Based on the performance of each clinical trial sites doing phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, only 40% or 39% meet enrollment targets. Unfortunately, 37% don't meet their targets, and 11% even fail to enroll patients. So it's a difficult thing to do clinical trials. It involves both the patient willingness and the physician's willingness to spend time. And in reality, clinical trials can be time consuming for both parties. So there are challenges, and I want you to be aware of the challenges. Of course, there's the concern about the side effects, there's the concern of placebo, and I want you to be aware that placebo controlled trials are only done for those diseases without standard of care. And very often nowadays, randomized clinical trial, phase 3 trials are not compared to placebo. It's actually compared to the standard of care drugs, meaning the drug that is best during and when the clinical trial was written is the comparison. It's important to educate you and the physician and the people that are there about the clinical trial. There's always that fear that you are being used as a guinea pig instead of trusting the physician. I think the most important key to success of clinical trials is communication. There should be clear-cut, honest, and objective communication between the patient and the physician. There's a lot of inconvenience, including travel times, number of visits, financial burden. This have to be also discussed as a part of the clinical trial process. There are top sources for clinical research information. Of course, your physician would be one of them, your specialty care physician, your oncologist. And of course, a lot of patients nowadays look at the internet as the source of their information for clinical trials. We have media, email, mail, mailed information. And of course, we have well-meaning family members who can share with us the latest and greatest trials that are being done. I want to make sure that there are certain what we call legitimate websites, and there are trials that are done outside of the standard legitimate website. And I would recommend clinicaltrials.gov. This is the source of most of the clinical trials or all of the clinical trials that is done in this country. There are, of course, challenges to enrollment, including the potential for toxicity. That's why we're doing clinical trials. For some reason or another, we do not fully know all the toxicity. There are also concerns of morbid conditions or comorbid conditions that can affect trial. There are also access issue, meaning distance or even availability of clinical trials. There are clinical research assistants and other regulatory persons that are important for clinical trials. And there are also biases by physicians. That's why they don't encourage their patients to be on clinical trial. There are also provider type of challenges, which include time, fear of losing patients, because majority of the time, not every single center have clinical trials, so they have to refer the patient out. And there's a fear that basically patients are not given the appropriate clinical trial. Comfort and communication style can be also important in clearly delivering what's being studied or discussing what's being studied. Other barriers could be politics, bad publicity, hospital concern, insurance, of course, HIPAA restriction, and sometimes looking at qualities of clinical trial. There are also logistic factors, cost, time, child support, lack of social support to attend the visits. You have to realize that very often when you are on a study like a clinical trial, there could be more frequent visit, more frequent testing when you are on clinical trials. Trial factors would be knowledge about the trial, specific populations, kidney function, specific criteria. Are you really eligible? Sometimes there could be 60 to 70 criteria that you have to check off and make sure that you're eligible for the clinical trial. The need for innovative and attractive clinical trials, the burden of research investigation and the burden of paperwork and many things can be a challenge as far as clinical trials and providing the right care. Let me define clearly, as I have been talking about clinical trials earlier, what a clinical trial is. It is an experiment for purpose of evaluating potentially beneficial therapies or treatment, as many controlled conditions as possible so it provides definitive answers to well-defined questions. So there's no argument that it's an experiment, but very often it's compared to standard of care or hopefully to improve the outcomes of your cancer. Objectives are more importantly whether it's to improve survival, to improve or decrease the recurrence of the disease, or basically to help look at exploratory markers such as biomarkers and identify things that will help you respond better or not. A clear-cut example would be the presence of gene mutations, and certain gene mutations or tumor mutations can predict your response to treatment or not. Presence or absence of immune markers can also predict your ability to respond to treatment or not. That's very important and very helpful. Objectives of the trial should be clearly described to you when you go to your physicians. The exclusion-inclusion criteria, what are you doing in the clinical trial? What kind of treatment? Why is it unique compared to standard of care? Possible side effects, how the drug is excreted, secondary endpoints, and correlative markers. In a clinical trial, when you sit down and read the consent form, you should understand the why, the who is being treated in the clinical trial, what are we trying to achieve, which, where, and when, and what are the bad toxicities that you expect potentially from the clinical trial. So at the end of the day, you will ask, what's in for me? Very often, patients are altruistic. If it benefits them, it can possibly benefit the next person with the same disease process and condition. We look at the scientific, medical, and ethical rationale for the trial. We have the institutional review board. We have the FDA who checks the investigator, Federal Drug Administration, make sure that the studies are ethical, they are not meant for harm, and the trial should protect the rights of the patient. And very important for those who participate in the clinical trial is that you can stop anytime if you have serious toxicity after discussing with the clinical investigator. What's the dose, the schedule, how long the treatment is, how long you would be followed on clinical trials. The timing of the assessments, when you do scans, lab tests is also very important and essential. You will be often given a timetable or a schedule for the clinical trial. Side effects is always monitored on a regular basis, whether it's monthly, every 2 weeks, every 2 months. There are dose reduction schedule, dose delay schedules, drugs that will support and prevent side effects such as growth factors, antibiotics, and other treatments to decrease the chance for toxicity. And there are clear reasons to stop medications. Serious toxicity and progression of disease when the cancer does not respond to the treatment. There are what we call single-blinded studies, studies that does not know the identity of the treatment received. Double-blind studies are studies where both the patient and the treating physician do not allow identity of the drug, meaning they don't know which drug you're receiving. That's the most objective and will be helpful in actually preventing biases. Placebo is often being used if there's no standard of care and it is a sham treatment, an inert treatment, but this is often used in randomized trial if there are no standard treatment options. That is very important to emphasize. Adverse side effects would include death, damage, nausea, vomiting, lowering of your platelets. As you probably know or not know, all these studies have been done in animal studies before first in human studies are being done. I will describe to you in the last few minutes what the type of clinical trials are. Phase 1 is for studies where we do not know the acceptable dose, we do not know the toxicity of the drug. These are often studies that would be important for those patients who do not have standard drug options already for their cancer. And very often, this is uh, a trial where we try to find options for those people who do not have an option for their cancer. Phase 2 clinical trials will be next, but I want to talk about pharmacokinetics, which is often done in phase 1 trials. What does the body do to the drug? How is it distributed around the body? And pharmacodynamics is what the drug does to the body. So these are important terms that you need to understand. Phase 2 clinical trials is when we study a drug effect based on the results of the phase 1, where we don't know the dose, we don't know the toxicity. Now we know the dose and the toxicity, so we study in a specific population, like breast cancer, colon cancer, brain tumors. We study that only in one population to test its efficacy on a disease process. With phase 1, we take all comers. With phase 3, this is standard of care treatment compared to experimental treatment. Very often, it's a combination of standard of care or comparison of standard of care versus the experimental treatment. Standard of care are FDA-approved drugs. Phase 4 is trials which are looking for long-term follow-up. Placebo effect is often well documented, meaning no treatment, standard treatment. There are vitamin C trials. Sometimes we use other placebo drugs for treatment, but very often there's sham drugs, and we want to make sure that it's ethical and we don't put people on placebo, as I emphasized earlier, if they have standard of care. So it's often standard of care plus placebo. There are biomarker trials. We have very good biomarkers in lung cancer, colon cancer, thyroid cancer, breast cancer that we now can target and have very good responses to the drugs. So the key is molecular targeted treatments. So in conclusion, clinical trials are a necessary component of cancer drug development. The message to you as a cancer survivor is to encourage patients to participate in the clinical trial because it will change the way we treat patients in the future and improve their care. In addition to that, improve their quality of life and improve survival. In summary, phase 1 clinical trials are testing new drugs on different type of tumors. Phase 2 is specific after we know the dose and toxicity. Phase 3 are the benefits of the drug compared to standard of care. In summary, today I just reviewed in a quick few minutes the standard of care and the reasons for doing clinical trials. I hope this explains clearly, and I would encourage you to participate in clinical trials because in this country, only 2 to 3% of patients actually participate in clinical trial. We wish we can improve that because we can improve patient care and survival very quickly if we have patients who understand the reason for doing clinical trials. In summary, you can benefit from the clinical trials, but in addition to that, you might help the next person live longer. And even some drugs nowadays can provide cure in some patients in the event of metastatic disease. I hope I improve your understanding. I hope I bring hope to your condition, and I hope your survival would be free of recurrences. Thank you.